wonder if anyone would like to comment further about the political and cultural response to whatever it is that's happening in the Middle East. Chris has suggested that there's an underlying political agenda that the government and maybe other parties are using for their own purposes.
Can I just add one point on the radicalization? Yes, there are radicals. The question is how many or what's the percentage they make out of the community. On the other hand, there is double standard when it comes to the way the mainstream media is dealing with these radicals. I can give another example of radicals that the media is looking at as a positive thing. We know that members of the Jewish community went to Israel to serve in the Israeli army during the war in Gaza, and they are allowed to go there, they are allowed to come back, and they are viewed within Israeli media as heroes. It doesn't take long to understand that this is also a form of radicals. So we do have double standard when it comes to this issue. On the issue of politicizing all Muslims, of course, like Suraj indicated, Muslims are a heterogeneous group. You don't have one voice that represents all Muslims, and even within the same sect, you will see that there are disagreements more than agreements when it comes to the representation of that, and to reduce all this kind of diversity in opinions to one or two-step solution is stupid, to be honest. And we've seen that after 11 or since 9/11, what was called the war on terror, which produced a bigger problem. I think if you are in a hole, you've got to stop digging, because we have realized that 13 years later, we have made a bigger problem. ISIS is worse than Al-Qaeda, and we know that. And we're using the same people, the same discourse, the same pretty much leaders to continue and to convince us that this is going to fix the war of terror.
Just to add to what I said before about using the Muslim community as a scapegoat for a larger problem, I think part of it is actually around the budget and the fact that Abbott and Hockey put up this terrible budget that affected people's lives, that was trying to unravel the social fabric of this country. And they wanted to get through a lot of very radical changes around making our country, in my opinion, more unfair. And it didn't go down very well. And we saw protests in the streets 5-6 months after a budget. When has anyone ever seen that before? People still taking to the streets. And I think that they needed a way out of that. They needed a way to change the discourse, change the story. It's quite convenient now that they've been able to change it to war and to marginalising a group in society. I know that sounds very, very cynical, but I really think that that is part of it, and that's very sad. And I think it's very sad that it's almost happened to be the Muslim community. It could have been any other group in society. They just picked the most convenient group at the time.
Could I just comment on that too, Paul? I'm Jane Dixon from Liberty Victoria. But we've seen all this before. We've been down these paths before, and we've all been reminded of that by the recent passing of Doc Whitlam. We went down these paths at the time that the communist threat was going to take over the world, and they were the scapegoat at that time, and Chris, I think, has referred to that to some degree. And it actually took Doc Whitlam, for example, to stand up and start making the Australian public face up to the realities of life, and to reverse a lot of the decision making that had gone on that was very comfortable at that time for the political majority before he changed their minds.
And I think the media has a large role to play as well, because at the moment politicians are so scared of offending the media. So, for example, I think we also saw it around native title, and a lot of people were so scared of the fact that Aboriginal people might come and take their backyards. And it took someone like Keating to actually stand up and say, no, you cannot say that. You cannot be racist. You actually have to look at this as casual, have an intelligent discussion. And instead, when somebody says something against Islam or against another group in society, we're too scared to call them out. Or our political leaders, I believe, are too scared to call people out on it. Instead, they just want to kind of paper over it and keep everyone happy.
I mean, the problem at the moment, surely, is there isn't a government. This is not 1972. The Greens are the only political party in Australia who are, and I'm not pushing Greens here, I'm just saying, they're the only political party who is likely to speak out on this sort of thing. You're not going to get this from the Labor Party now. And there is and I think there's real need to direct some significant part of our thinking towards that problem.
I want to go back to the issue of resources for communities and this radicalization. For me, an important element of youth of Muslim community here and other youth of other communities of here is resources to move to artistic field, to express their culture in artistic arena in a constructive way. If youth of the communities cannot have access to art as a production of symbols and discourse that they like, the public sphere in it, they are absent. The public sphere doesn't get their element of art, their element of symbolic presence in the society. And if the society doesn't get their element of presence symbolically, then radicalism becomes a presence of symbolic. So we have two choices. Either we have resources to allow youth of these migrant communities to come in the field of arts and express themselves in symbolic field within the society, or we prevent them to come in their arts present in the society, then somebody else with another discourse will come to the public sphere and will be in the society.
I wonder,
Hi, my name's Fatima. I'm a student at RMIT University. Currently, I think the need for media these days, especially for youth, is just support. We need someone to support us, particularly with all the corruption and one or two individuals just ruining other people's lives. It's just inhumane. Like, we need people to just kind of give that support, just to make sure that they don't go and do the wrong things, because what those stupid individuals are doing is just inhuman, and no individual has any right to do it.
I wonder if we could move the discussion to the role of the media in the in intensifying concerns amongst the community, because clearly there's been a range of positions that are being expressed here today. They're very different from the ones that we're seeing day after day on television and in the newspapers and so on.
Sorry, before we move on, I'd actually like to hear what you mean by support. I mean, what do you think, what would support mean in this context?
Support meaning like someone to just check up on it, see how we're going. Like, some individuals think that's the way of getting attention. So if they were to study or go on to do some further stream of education, whatever they wanted to do, just to ensure that they have someone to kind of follow up on it, and just not gain the wrong ideas by just asking these groups.
Just on that point, do you think it's important that the youth who may be disempowered, disenfranchised, have role models within their communities that are given some degree of power and authority, for example, within the police force or within government, given some respect and attention and a chance to actually influence their peers?
So my name is Wael Mohammed. I'm involved in youth work and community development. So what I'm going to say will touch on this note, but it will also go back to the first topic. So I don't think there's enough being done with social cohesion and community development and supporting young people and creating an Australian community. I think it's an external problem what is happening. And young people in particular are not getting the support that they need in regards to, you know, whether it's leadership, whether it's just assisting them with their you know, daily tasks, daily issues, or finding an identity. So possibly if the effort into trying to create an Australian multicultural community, if we put more effort into that, and if there was more in the budget, then we'd definitely be able to create a great Australian community and address these matters.
So, can I raise this as a very important issue that, and people have talked about how multiculturalism has evolved in Australia from the early and mid-1970s, when Australia was fundamentally a monocultural society which tolerated smaller numbers of people who looked, spoke and did things differently to the rest of the community, but were tolerated because, in a sense, they didn't present any overt threat, in inverted commas. What I think now is the question for Australian identity is, what does an integrated multicultural Australian community look like, where the dominant paradigm of the last 200 years no longer is applicable?
Whenever they talk about the youth, or what you mean by support the youth, they need to identify, highlight the positive contribution of Muslims in this country, because of one or two lunatics doing stupid things, and does not represent the Muslim community. So when the statement comes from media, the statement comes from government, they need to acknowledge that one. There are positive things. This is very small individual doing. If you look at the percentage of this one, you go to 0.00% of youth doing this one, does not represent the Muslim community. When they need support for youth needs sort of assurance from the government, you are counted as Australian youth. You are not others. You're not binary, us and them. This paradigm has to go.
So is there a role, for example, for youth ambassadors representing the Islamic faith?
Say it again?
Youth ambassadors, for example.
There are many Muslim youth organizations work in Muslim community, actively work. They do positive, lots of contribution and supporting them. These sort of organizations are not seen by government or media. They don't see them.
So they need to be included more.
Yes, and they shouldn't want to pick up the negative forces to pick as a sample.
Can I just, on this particular point, Jane, there is a program with La Trobe University's Center for Dialogue called the Muslim Leader Program. I think Wael is one of the fresh graduates. I'm sure Wael can give us maybe a minute description of this program, because I think initiatives like this need to be known to us and need to be also endorsed and supported. So,
okay. So Muslim Leadership Program was a program where 10 young Muslims, all from diverse communities, had Sri Lankan, Malaysian, Singapore, Eritrean, Oromo, Lebanese, so Australian, so everyone is quite different in that sense. So that kind of shows that Muslims come in with quite diverse community. So we engaged with the Age, the Herald Sun, politicians in Melbourne Parliament, and we went out to Canberra. We spoke to almost 30 politicians. So we engaged and we had dialogue. So what was the overall understanding that we kind of gathered was that most of these organisations or politicians actually don't have the opportunity to have dialogue with just regular Muslims, and that really broke down the barriers on stereotypes and perceptions.
Yeah.
So just through dialogue we were able to understand each other and really break the barriers and stereotypes that were available, and we made such huge progress where we believe that through some contributions within the group, shortly after some politicians came out and actually had a deeper understanding of the Australian Muslim community. So it actually worked just through dialogue. But also just touch on that other note as well. I think that this whole young Muslims narrative needs to be changed. It's not young Muslims that are the matter, it's young people in the Australian community are not getting the support that they need. So we really need to change that narrative.
I agree with you, but the inclusion so that we don't just narrow what we are focusing on.
Yeah.
We illuminate all the companies so that if you're talking to young people, and we need storytelling, that we can tell Muslim stories, we can tell Indian stories, whatever.
Yeah.
And we need the art world to step up through education to have children cared for in schools about the situation they feel. If you're a Muslim kid in school, how the others are responding to it. So everyone's in the spotlight, you know, not just, and the media always focus on the victim or and then nothing is learned by the community. So it's about getting resources where some real work is being done, with fleshing up the storytellers and illuminating their stories, with letting poor people in the community who don't know the effect of Muslim culture on everyday life. If they could walk down the street and say, oh, that happened because it happened in Muslim culture that affected our architecture, what is the National Trust doing about that? What is the gallery having fashion designers come in at a time when the community is at risk? So we need to actually hand over the citizens some information, some healing, and some change.
Just pick up on the point, especially areas about multiculturalism. The attack on that kind of policy has been ongoing for some time. It's not a new phenomenon. I fundamentally believe that that's a bigger issue for us than what's happening right this second. There is no viable option, I think, for a genuine society to grow in the current global environment, except through, whether you call it multiculturalism or some other label, a way in which people can live together and recognise the differences. I don't actually believe there's a viable alternative to it. And the whole conversation around multiculturalism hasn't worked, I think, is a red herring. We have to find a way to ensure the concept underneath that in fact does work in Australia. Because there actually isn't, I think, an alternative which is a viable, given the nature of global society today, the movement across borders. It's a fundamental part of who we are, and we need to ensure that that's the future.
Hi, my name is Mufti Muhammad, and I'm from Islamic background, from North East Africa, Eritrea, and I've grown up in Melbourne, and I work in Melbourne, and I work for the Office of Adam Band, and while campaigning recently, I just to illustrate on how the media is affecting the lives of ordinary Muslims. While campaigning recently, we door knocked a female's house in Melbourne, here in public housing, and we spent an hour listening to how a man has been verbally abusing her for 3 years, and how she can't leave the house before 10 a.m. because that's what time he leaves for work, and how he comes and approaches her in the park and in front of her kids, verbally abuses her, and a few times she was inside with him in the lift, and how he bangs the mirrors on the lift, and she's even scared to go to the police. She doesn't have trust in the system itself, and I just want every Australian to imagine that what if this was their mother, their sister? I mean, it's not acceptable for any human being to live in such fear, and I call on our leaders to be more responsible with their words and to lead us rather than divide us. And that's all I have to say.
My point is a little bit responding to your question earlier, and to that, I think the messaging has been, topsy-turvy. Muslims are kind of somehow the culprits here, but in fact they're very much the victims of this. I mean, it's forgotten that these wars are happening in Muslim countries and they're dying in the thousands, and it's not mentioned. For example, 2 weeks ago, a Kurdish journalist was beheaded, and I could not find an article anywhere about it. Anywhere, 67 Syrian journalists have been beheaded. It's the brunt of what the IS is doing is being felt by the Muslim community there and here, and yet somehow Muslims need to be out there apologizing and somehow, saying that this isn't us and we have to create a difference. It feels that, the prism in which we're being seen is just clouded.
I wonder if we could shift to a discussion of what the broader implications are for Australian society of this current discussion. Jane, I know you've been concerned in particular about the legislative proposals that are in front of the Australian Parliament. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting the comment you make about, for example, the foreign arthritis legislation before Parliament at the moment, it might well have captured people in the past going overseas to, for example, to Israel, but also even the Spanish Civil War. And we can think of many passages about history where people went overseas who would now be caught up by this legislation. The problem is the changes are being pushed through so quickly that the Australian public hasn't really had time to sit down and understand what is being done and the way in which their freedoms are being impinged on. But I think the big issue really is to educate and inform, and unfortunately I suspect that a lot of the time the public is working very long hours, coming home and switching on to The Bachelor or some other program on TV that doesn't really inform them, and they simply aren't getting the information except in short sound bites from the media. And the challenge is how to better inform the public about that there is no real threat, and it's just like what they used to call the yellow peril in terms of communism. It's the same sort of ignorance that drives this alleged threat at the moment.
I just want to give two examples from the media that actually reveals the less and misrepresentation of Muslim issues in our mainstream media. One of them is an article on front page The Age, where the word in Arabic was totally lost in its translation. It was Baqiya, and Baqiya is a slogan raised by ISIS currently, the Dawla al-Islamiyya Baqiya, meaning that the Islamic State will stay forever. It will never cease to exist. This is to raise the morals of their constituency. However, when this word was transliterated into English, it was, the qaf sound was K, not Q. And it was written as Baqiya. And when the journalist asked somebody within the Arab community, do you know what the meaning of Baqiya? He said, yeah, somebody is crying. Because Baqiya also, which is not Baqiya, means a woman who is weeping or crying, and totally missed the whole thing, of Baqiya as opposed to ceasing to exist. And it went to a front page and, it created a chaos afterwards. The other example, actually, I was involved in. 2 days ago, I sent a link from Arabic media to two of my contacts in a major or leading news outlets in Australia. I said, please see below the link and see my translation of an excerpt. And the title says, President Sisi promised to grant a presidential pardon to free Al Jazeera journalists, which includes Peter Grista. And it was in Arabic, and nobody has heard of it, because all they care about is accessing the New York Times reporter who don't access authentic information in Arabic and listen to what's being spoken about us, as opposed to seeing what is written in Arabic about Arab-related or Islamic-related issues.
Speaking about media, I think, say, Australian media is not different from the media in other countries. In the sense, they are linked to other privileged and interested groups. So, if we can get through the message through the available media, it's a good thing, but it is becoming increasingly harder. So if we look about 20 years back, what happened in Australia, the media freedom has come down in scale, if you look at freedom index. Now, especially young people are interested in other alternative media, say through Facebook or Twitter or Tumblr or whatever, sort of other sources. I think if we could find alternative media to get across our message of the value of multiculturalism, social inclusion and so on, I think we would be able to counter the current trend. Otherwise, what would happen is, with the government implementing increasingly terrible anti-terror laws, alienation will grow, more young people will alienate, and as a result, more young people will radicalize, and That has been the worldwide trend.
I was going to make a very similar point, but I'll maybe say it a little bit more explicitly because I can be a bit more cynical, which is just to say that most of our media here is owned by Rupert Murdoch, and he has a vested interest in keeping people like Tony Abbott in power because he's the one who gives him the system that allows him to continue to make money. And so I think that it is going to be very difficult for us to get these stories out through the media. So yes, we need to find alternative ways. And the reason that I went into politics is because I fundamentally believe that we have to have a political solution to a lot of this, and it just requires people with the guts to stand up and run for politics and say the right thing. It was Murdoch himself who told his papers to run stories to kick Whitlam out, and so that's why we lost one of the Prime Ministers who actually cared about equality. And I don't really have a way around the Murdoch press apart from small independent things like Facebook media, social media, one-to-one conversations. All of these things will hopefully add up to enough, but also it'd be great if we had some more politicians who actually cared and said the right thing, and if they could come from the communities who are being marginalised, I think that would be even better.
Can I just comment on that?
I think what you're raising is a very important point about the need for greater political leadership, but I think that the solution lies within civil society taking a voice here, and I think it's about civil society articulating what it is that it values, and in particular marginalised groups having a voice and leading that discussion.
I was about to make the same comment in different words. I think leadership can be across all parts of the spectrum. It can be in different organisations, and I think that what's just been discussed before about the La Trobe University initiative is a great example of some leadership being shown and really effective dialogue within the community and effective inclusion. And so we need to think laterally about more of those solutions that involve the whole of civil society and leadership throughout.
So there have been lots of suggestions already about what we should do. In the last few minutes, I'd like to ask people to focus on that question more explicitly. That is, what should be the nature of our response to the problem that we've been elaborating here today?
I think the fact that we are sitting around today is a great first step, and we are saying that not in our names, and we are going to oppose this kind of marginalization of a particular community, and we are going to say no to that. Of course, this has to continue. I think we have to go in parallel. We need to address the internal issue within the Muslim community, why the fragile elements of some members of the community choose to be radicalized. And of course we need to address these issues and to attend to it through education and through proper knowledge and through providing resources. I think the magic word that Mushtaba said today is provide resources to address that. And while we do that, we have to also work in media and to promote civil society initiatives that also pour into this stream. So it is a complicated problem that cannot be addressed or solved by a simple or one-step solution. We need to have the depth in also in any solution that comes out of it.
I think talking, writing, saying is whatever instrument we have. If you have a Facebook, write it. If you have a Twitter, write it. If you have a community and school, talk in it. We need to be an active citizen. If you resign from your citizenship right, which is thinking and talking, then acting, public space doesn't accept emptiness.